She sat alone at the feast, until the Alpha King's mother said, "Come stand beside my son." The hall smelled of roasted meat, warm bread, and melted candle wax. Long tables stretched from one end of the room to the other, and every seat was filled with wolves in fine clothes, laughing loud enough to shake the windows. Gold light bounced off silver plates. Somewhere near the back, a group of young pack members clinked their cups together and shouted a toast nobody could quite hear over the noise. At the very end of one table sat a girl who did not belong there, at least not in the eyes of the room. Her name was Mira, and she sat with an empty chair on her left and an empty chair on her right, like the space around her had been marked off with an invisible rope. She kept her eyes on her plate. She had learned a long time ago that a full plate was the best kind of shield. If you were busy eating, nobody expected you to talk. Nobody expected you to explain why a border girl with plain clothes and a borrowed necklace was sitting at the king's feast at all. She had arrived 3 days earlier, brought in by 2 guards who barely spoke to her the whole ride. She still did not fully understand why she was there. She only knew it had something to do with an old agreement between her home pack and the royal pack, something signed long before she was born, something about a debt that never seemed to have an end date. Across the hall, at the head of the longest table, sat the man everyone called King Ronan. He was young for a king, not yet 30, but he carried himself like someone who had been carrying weight since he was a boy. He was not eating either. His plate sat untouched in front of him, while his eyes moved slowly across the room, stopping now and then on the empty chairs scattered along the tables. Chairs that should have held guests of honor. Chairs that stayed empty because nobody dared sit close to a king who had turned down every match his advisors brought him. Rumors said he was waiting for someone. Nobody knew who. Some said he was simply difficult. Some said he had loved someone once and lost her, though nobody could say when or how. The truth was quieter than any of the rumors, and Ronan had never bothered to correct any of them. Beside him, at the same table but seated a respectful distance back, sat his mother, Queen Serena. She was not a woman who raised her voice, but she was a woman the whole hall watched anyway, the way people watch a sky that might be about to change. She had buried a husband years ago and had guided the pack through 2 wars since. She did not tolerate foolishness at her own table, and she had grown tired of watching her son sit at the center of a room and look like the loneliest man in it. She noticed the empty chairs around Mira the same moment her son did. She noticed the way Mira kept her head down, the way her shoulders stayed pulled in tight, as if trying to take up less space in a room too big and too loud for her. Serena set down her cup. She rose from her seat, and though she did not do it loudly, the room noticed. Conversations did not stop all at once, but they thinned out, the way noise thins out right before a storm arrives. She walked the length of the table, past dukes who straightened in their chairs, past a general who half rose out of habit before she waved him back down with 2 fingers. She walked past her own son, who watched her with the stillness of a man who already suspected where she was going and had decided not to stop her. She reached the end of the table, where Mira sat frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Come stand beside my son," Serena said. 4 words. That was all. But the hall went quiet in a way that had texture to it, a silence you could feel pressing against your ears. Mira set her fork down carefully, as if it might make noise if she moved too fast. "My lady, I don't think that's—" "I didn't ask what you think," Serena said. Her voice was not unkind. It also was not a request. "I told you where to stand." Somewhere down the table, a goblet met the wood a little too hard, and everyone pretended not to hear it. Mira stood. Her legs worked without asking her permission first. The walk from her seat to the head of the table was maybe 30 steps, and it felt longer than the 3-day ride that had brought her to the castle in the first place. Ronan did not smile when she approached. He did not reach for her hand or make any grand gesture. He simply watched her come, the way a person watches weather they have been waiting on, without admitting it, even to themselves. She stopped beside his chair, unsure what to do with her hands, and ended up holding her own wrist, as if it needed keeping in place. "Sit," Serena said, though not to Mira this time. A servant appeared with a chair that Mira was fairly certain had not existed a few seconds earlier. It was placed close enough to the king's seat that when she lowered herself into it, her sleeve brushed against his arm. He did not pull away. "You should eat," he said quietly, just for her. "I was eating. You were hiding behind a plate." "That's different." He said it without any sharpness, like he had noticed an hour ago, and only just found a reason to mention it. Mira looked down at her hands. "People were staring at the empty chairs around me. They're staring at the full one now. That sounds worse." "No," he said, turning to look at her properly for the first time that night. Something crossed his face, too quick to name, and too slow to miss completely. "It's better." Down the table, Serena lifted her cup toward no one in particular, and everyone at once. Toward her son, and the girl who had not asked to be noticed, and was going to have to get used to it, whether the hall liked it or not. The feast went on around them, the noise rising again, the music picking back up, but the two empty chairs at the far end of the table stayed empty for the rest of the night. Nobody sat in them again. The morning after the feast, Mira woke up in a room too large for one person, in a bed, with sheets softer than anything she had ever slept on before. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then she remembered, and her stomach dropped the way it had been dropping since the guards first came for her 3 days earlier. She had grown up in a small pack near the northern border, in a village where the winters were long and the summers were short, and every family knew every other family's business whether they wanted to or not. Her father had been a quiet man who fixed fences and mended roofs. Her mother had died when Mira was 9, and after that her father had grown quieter still, until one day he sat her down and told her about an old debt. He explained it badly, the way people explain things they do not fully understand themselves. Something about the border pack owing the royal pack a favor from before Mira was born. Something about her grandfather and a war that never quite ended the way it should have. He told her that when the time came, the debt might need to be paid, and that she should not be afraid if that day arrived. The day arrived faster than either of them expected. 2 guards came to the door on a gray morning, polite but firm, and told her she was needed at the capital. Her father hugged her at the gate longer than he ever had before, and neither of them said the word goodbye, because saying it would have made it feel more permanent than either of them could stand. She had expected to be given some kind of job, a servant's position maybe, or a place among the kitchen staff. She had not expected to be seated beside the king at a feast attended by half the kingdom's nobility. She got dressed slowly that morning, in clothes that had been laid out for her by a maid who introduced herself as Talia, and who talked enough for both of them, filling the silence with details about the castle, about which hallways were shortcuts, and which stairs creaked, and which of the guards were friendly, and which ones you should avoid making eye contact with before their morning meal. "Is it true," Talia asked while braiding Mira's hair, "that the queen picked you out herself?" "I don't know what happened," Mira admitted. "One minute I was eating alone, and the next minute I was sitting next to the king." Talia laughed, delighted. "The whole castle is talking about it. Nobody sat that close to him at a feast in years. Not since." She stopped herself. "Since what?" Talia's hands paused in Mira's hair for just a second. "Nothing. Old story. Not mine to tell." Mira wanted to press further, but something in Talia's face told her this was not the morning for it. She let the question go, though it settled somewhere in the back of her mind and stayed there. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Mira learned the castle the way a person learns a new town, slowly and mostly by accident. She learned that the kitchen staff started their fires before the sun came up, and that if she wandered down early enough, the head cook, a broad woman named Odessa, would hand her a warm roll without being asked and tell her to eat it before anyone official saw and made a fuss about proper meal times. She learned that the library on the 3rd floor was almost always empty in the afternoons, and that the old librarian who kept it did not mind if she sat in the corner for hours reading books about the history of the kingdom, trying to make sense of a world she had been dropped into without warning. She learned, too, that the other border pack workers scattered through the castle staff treated her with a kind of cautious pride, as though her presence at the feast reflected well on all of them, even though none of them quite understood what it meant either. A stable hand named Corwin, who had come from a village 2 days south of her own, made a point of nodding to her whenever their paths crossed, a small gesture that meant more to her than he probably realized. "You're one of us," he told her once, adjusting a saddle strap without looking up. "Doesn't matter where you're sitting at supper. Don't let anyone tell you different." She held on to that more than she let on. Not everyone was so kind. The nobility watched her with open curiosity, some amused, some annoyed, a few outright hostile, in ways they tried and mostly failed to hide behind polite words. She overheard more than one comment about border blood and common manners, delivered just loud enough to be sure she caught it. She learned to keep her face still when it happened, the same way she had learned to keep her face still through years of watching neighbors whisper about her father's quiet grief after her mother died. Ronan noticed more than she expected him to. A week after the feast, he found her in the library, curled into the window seat with a book about pack law balanced on her knees. "Odessa tells me you've been down to the kitchens 3 mornings this week," he said, leaning against the doorway with an ease that seemed almost unfamiliar on him, like he was still learning how to stand in a room without an audience. "Word travels fast in this castle. Word has always traveled fast here. It's one of the few things that hasn't changed since I was a boy." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, close enough to talk quietly. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, you know. Not to Odessa, not to the stable hands, not to the nobles who think you should be intimidated by them. I'm not trying to prove anything." She closed the book gently. "I'm trying to understand where I've landed. That's different." He considered this for a moment. "Fair enough. Any conclusions so far?" "That this place is bigger and stranger than anywhere I've ever been, and that most of the people in it have opinions about me they haven't bothered to share to my face. Welcome to court life." He almost smiled. "It gets easier. Not because people stop having opinions, because eventually you stop caring what they are." "Is that how it worked for you?" "Something like that." His expression shifted, just slightly, something more guarded settling behind his eyes. "Took longer than I'd like to admit." She found out about the old story 2 weeks later, from a noblewoman named Delphine who seemed to enjoy sharing information almost as much as she enjoyed collecting it. They met in the castle gardens, where Mira had taken to walking in the early mornings before the rest of the castle woke up. It was the only time the halls felt quiet enough for her to breathe properly, and the gardens were her favorite place to do it, full of flowers she did not know the names of, and paths that wound between hedges tall enough to block out the noise of the kitchens starting their fires. Delphine found her sitting on a stone bench near a fountain, and without asking permission, sat down beside her. "You're the border girl," Delphine said. It was not a question. "I have a name." "I know. Mira." Delphine smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "I'm just making conversation. You've caused quite a stir, you know, sitting next to the king like that. Some people think it means something. Others think the queen is just tired of watching him sulk." Mira said nothing, waiting to see where this was going. "You should know," Delphine continued, "that he was engaged once, years ago, before he became king. A girl from one of the eastern packs. Very beautiful, very well liked. She died before the wedding happened. Some kind of accident, they say, though nobody talks about the details." Mira felt something tighten in her chest, though she could not have said exactly why. "That's terrible." It was. "He hasn't looked twice at anyone since. Which is why everyone's so curious about you." Delphine studied her for a moment, the kind of look that felt like being measured. "Don't get too comfortable. Kings like him don't fall in love twice. They fall once, and then they spend the rest of their lives being polite to everyone else." She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked away before Mira could respond, leaving her alone with the fountain and a question she did not know how to answer. Despite Delphine's warning, or maybe because of it, Mira found herself paying closer attention to Ronan over the following weeks. Not in any obvious way. She was not foolish enough to think a border girl had any real claim on a king's attention. But she noticed things. She noticed that he ate breakfast alone in a small room off the main hall, usually finishing before most of the castle was even awake. She noticed that he walked the training grounds most afternoons, not to fight, but to watch the younger guards practice, offering quiet corrections that made them stand up straighter. She noticed that he almost never laughed, but that his mouth did something close to it when one of the stable boys told a joke that was not particularly funny, and Ronan pretended it was anyway, just to see the boy smile. She noticed, too, that he watched her sometimes across rooms, in a way that was careful and never obvious, the way you watch something you are not sure you are allowed to want. They did not speak much at first, beyond the occasional greeting in hallways, but then, 3 weeks after the feast, she found him in the garden during her early morning walk, sitting on the same stone bench where Delphine had once found her. "You're up early," she said, more surprised than she meant to sound. "I don't sleep well," he admitted. "Never have. Mind wander too much at night." She hesitated, then sat down at the other end of the bench, leaving a careful distance between them. "What does it wander to?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fountain instead of at her. "Different things. The pack's finances, the eastern border, whether the roof on the old granary is going to collapse before we get around to fixing it. That sounds exhausting." "It is." He glanced at her sideways. "What about you? Why are you up before the sun?" "The gardens are quiet. Everywhere else in the castle, people look at me like I'm a puzzle they're trying to solve. And here? Here it's just flowers. Flowers don't care where I'm from." Something in his face softened, just slightly. "No, I suppose they don't." They sat in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that did not need filling. When the sun finally rose high enough to touch the tops of the hedges, they both stood at the same time, as if some invisible signal had passed between them. "I should get back," Mira said. "Talia will be looking for me." "Of course." He paused, then added, almost carefully, "You could come back tomorrow, if you wanted." "I usually do." "I know." He almost smiled. "I've noticed." She walked away with her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest, something she did not have a name for yet, but suspected she would learn soon enough. The political pressure started quietly, the way most pressure at court seemed to. A visiting lord from a wealthy southern pack, a man named Bastian, arrived at the castle a month after Mira's first garden conversation with Ronan, bringing with him a sister he clearly hoped would catch the king's attention. The sister was polished, well-spoken, and fluent in exactly the kind of politics Mira still struggled to follow, and for a week the castle buzzed with speculation about whether this visit might finally produce the match the advisors had been hoping for since Ronan took the throne. Mira tried not to let it bother her. She told herself, more than once, that she had no real claim on the king's attention beyond a handful of quiet mornings in a garden, and that it would be foolish to expect more than that. But she noticed the way her stomach tightened every time she saw Bastian's sister laughing at something Ronan said across the dinner table, and she noticed, too, the careful distance Ronan kept, polite but unmistakably formal, nothing like the ease he showed on their morning walks. She found herself avoiding the garden for 2 mornings in a row, telling herself she simply had other things to do, though the real reason was closer to fear than anything else. On the 3rd morning, she went anyway, unable to stay away any longer, and found Ronan already there, sitting on their bench with an expression that looked almost relieved when he saw her approaching. "I thought you might not come," he said. "I thought you might be busy, with your guests." "My advisors think I should be busy with my guests." His voice carried a flatness that told her exactly how he felt about the arrangement. "Bastian's sister is perfectly pleasant. She's also not someone I have any interest in marrying, and I've told my mother as much a dozen times this week alone. You don't have to explain yourself to me. I want to, though." He turned to face her fully. "I don't want you thinking, even for a moment, that a week of formal dinners with a southern lord's sister changes anything about these mornings. About us." The word hung between them, simple and enormous at the same time. Neither of them had used it before, not directly, though it had been sitting underneath every conversation for weeks. "Us," Mira repeated quietly. "Unless I've misread things badly." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, rare enough on him that it caught her off guard. "Have I?" "No," she said, and something in her chest finally loosened after 2 days of holding it tight. You haven't misread anything. Bastian and his sister left a week later, their visit concluding with polite formality and no announcement of any engagement, much to the disappointment of several advisors who had been quietly hoping otherwise. Delphine, predictably, had opinions about the outcome, which she shared freely at the next opportunity. You do understand, she told Mira in the hallway outside the dining room, that turning away a match like that has consequences. Bastian's pack controls half the southern trade routes. His sister would have brought real advantages to this kingdom. What exactly do you bring? Mira considered the question honestly before answering, refusing to let the sting of it show on her face. I don't know yet, but it isn't my decision to make on his behalf, and it isn't yours either. Delphine did not have a response for that, and walked away without one. Over the following months, the early morning walks became a habit neither of them mentioned out loud, but both of them kept. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply walked in silence, comfortable in a way Mira had not expected to feel with a man who ruled over half a continent's worth of packs. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn a new language, one small piece at a time. She learned that he had become king younger than he wanted to, after his father died suddenly of an illness that came on fast and left almost no time for goodbyes. She learned that he carried guilt about things that were not his fault, the way people who lose parents too early often do. She learned that the girl Delphine had mentioned, the one who died before her wedding, had been someone Ronan cared for deeply, though not in the way most people assumed. They had grown up together. She had been more like a sister to him than anything else, and her death had left a hole that people mistook for heartbreak of a different kind. Everyone thinks I've been mourning a lost love for 6 years, he told her one morning, sitting on their usual bench while frost still clung to the grass. The truth is simpler and sadder. I just lost a friend, and I never found the energy to explain it to anyone, so I let them believe what they wanted. That sounds lonely. It was. It is. He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel like the only person in the garden, in the castle, maybe in the whole kingdom. Less lonely lately, though. She felt her face warm despite the cold morning air. I'm glad. Are you? His voice had gone quieter. Glad to be here, I mean. Not just this morning, any of it. The feast, the chair, all of it. She considered the question honestly before answering. I was terrified at first. I still don't fully understand why I was brought here, or what this old debt was supposed to mean. But I'm not sorry I came. Good, he said, because I'm not sorry either. Neither of them said anything else that morning, but something had shifted between them, some quiet agreement neither one needed to speak out loud. The kingdom held its harvest festival a few weeks later, an old tradition that brought villagers from the surrounding lands into the castle grounds for a day of food, music, and games that had been passed down for generations. Mira had never seen anything like it. Where her home village celebrated the harvest with a modest gathering around a single bonfire, the capital turned the whole event into something closer to a small world of its own, with stalls selling honeyed nuts and dyed ribbons, musicians playing in every courtyard, and children chasing each other between the legs of adults who did not seem to mind. Ronan found her near a stall selling roasted chestnuts, watching a group of children attempt some kind of relay race that had clearly lost track of its own rules, somewhere around the second lap. You look like you're actually enjoying yourself, he said, coming to stand beside her. I am. Is that surprising? A little. Most days you look like you're trying to survive the castle rather than enjoy it. He bought 2 bags of chestnuts from the stall and handed her one. This is different. Good different. They walked through the festival together for the rest of the afternoon, and for once, nobody seemed particularly interested in staring at them or whispering about the arrangement. The villagers were too busy with their own celebrations to care much about court politics, and for a few hours Mira felt something close to normal, like she could simply be a girl walking beside a man she cared about, without the weight of crowns and old debts pressing down on every interaction. They stopped near a small stage where an older musician was teaching a group of children a simple dance, clapping out the rhythm with exaggerated patience. Ronan watched for a moment, something wistful crossing his face. "My father used to bring me to this festival every year," he said. "Before he became too busy with the kingdom to spare the time, I remember him dancing with my mother right about there." He nodded toward the open space in front of the stage. "I haven't danced at this festival since he died. Would you want to?" He looked at her, surprised by the question. Would you? She thought about her own father, about the quiet way he had lived his life, mending fences and asking for nothing, and about how proud he would have been to see her standing here, in a festival crowd, being asked to dance by a king. "Yes," she said, "I would." They danced badly, both of them a little out of practice, laughing more than they managed any real rhythm, but nobody around them seemed to mind, and for the length of one song, Mira forgot entirely about debts, and politics, and empty chairs, and simply let herself be happy. Not everyone in the castle was pleased with the direction things were taking. Delphine, in particular, seemed to grow colder toward Mira as the weeks passed, her polite conversations in the garden replaced with tight smiles across dinner tables and comments made just loud enough to be overheard. "It's sweet, really," Mira heard her say one evening to a cluster of other noble women, not quite out of earshot. A border girl, catching the king's eye, like something out of an old story. "I only hope she understands what she's gotten herself into. Kings need queens who understand politics, alliances, the weight of a crown. Not girls who grew up mending fences." Mira kept walking, pretending she had not heard, though the words followed her down the hallway and settled somewhere uncomfortable in her chest. She was not foolish. She knew Delphine was not entirely wrong. She did not understand politics the way the nobility did. She did not know the names of every allied pack or the history behind every old grudge that still simmered beneath polite smiles at royal dinners. She had grown up worrying about whether the harvest would be enough to get her family through winter, not about which duke owed which favor to which king. She brought her worries to Serena eventually, unable to carry them alone any longer. She found the queen in her private study one afternoon, surrounded by papers and letters that seemed to require more attention than any one person should have to give. "You look troubled," Serena said, without looking up from the letter in her hands. "I'm not sure I belong here," Mira admitted. "Not really. I don't know the things a queen should know. I don't know how to talk to dukes or manage alliances or any of it." Serena finally set down her letter and looked at Mira properly. "Do you know why I chose you that night at the feast?" Mira shook her head. "Because my son had been surrounded by people who knew exactly how to talk to dukes and manage alliances for 6 years, and not one of them made him want to smile. You sat alone at the end of a table, uncomfortable and out of place, and within a week he was walking to the garden every morning like it was the only appointment on his calendar worth keeping." She stood and walked around her desk, resting a hand briefly on Mira's shoulder. "Politics can be taught, child. I will teach you myself, if it comes to that. But you cannot teach a person to make someone else feel less alone. Either you have that, or you don't. You have it. That's rarer than any lesson in politics I could give you." Mira did not know what to say, so she simply nodded, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for weeks. "Delphine will keep talking," Serena added, returning to her desk. "People like her always do. Let her talk. Talk has never built or broken a kingdom on its own. It's what people do that matters, not what they say about each other over dinner." Mira lingered a moment longer, curiosity finally winning out over caution. "Can I ask you something?" Serena glanced up. "You may ask. I make no promises about answering. Talia mentioned once, when I first arrived, that nobody had sat that close to your son at a feast in years." She stopped herself before saying more. Was she talking about the girl Delphine mentioned, the one who died? Something crossed Serena's face, old grief worn smooth by years of handling it. "Yes and no. My son told you the truth about her, I imagine. She was like a sister to him, not a lover, whatever the rest of the court chose to believe. But there is another part of that story he may not have told you, because it is not entirely his to tell." She set down her pen and folded her hands. "My husband and I lost a daughter, long before Ronan was born. She lived only a few days. It is not something we spoke of often, even to each other, but it changed how I raised my son afterward. I held on tighter than I should have. I made him afraid of losing people, without ever meaning to. When his friend died 6 years ago, I watched him build walls I had, in some small way, taught him to build. It has taken me a long time to understand that the kindest thing I could do for him now is stop protecting him from feeling things, and instead let him choose who he lets close enough to feel them with. She looked at Mira with something unguarded in her expression, rare for a woman who kept her feelings as carefully as she kept the kingdom's ledgers. You are the first person in a long while who has made him want to lower those walls on his own. I will not pretend that does not matter to me. Mira felt her throat tighten. Thank you for telling me. Don't thank me yet. A hint of dry humor returned to Serena's voice. Wait until you've spent a full winter dealing with this family's stubbornness. Then decide if gratitude is still the right word. The real trouble did not come from Delphine, though. It came 6 months after the feast, in the form of a messenger from Mira's home pack, arriving at the castle gates with news that made her stomach drop before she even heard the words. Her father was ill. Not the kind of illness that passed with rest and time, but the kind that settled into a person's bones and did not leave. The messenger did not know how much time he had left, only that he had asked for his daughter, and that the healer back home did not think it would be wise to wait long to send her. Mira left within the hour, riding through the night with 2 guards Ronan insisted accompany her, despite her protests that she could manage the journey alone. You're not going alone, he told her, standing at the stables while she checked the straps on her horse's saddle, with hands that would not quite stop shaking. That's not a discussion. I don't want to be a burden. You've never been a burden. He caught her hands, stilling them gently. Go to your father. Do what you need to do. I'll be here when you get back. She looked up at him, and for the first time since arriving at the castle, she let herself cry in front of someone else, the fear and grief she had been holding back finally breaking through. He did not say anything comforting, did not offer empty words about everything being fine. He simply held her for a moment, steady and quiet, until she found her breath again. The ride north took 3 days. Her father was thinner than she remembered, his face pale against the pillows, but his eyes lit up when she walked through the door, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had changed at all. You look well, he said, his voice weaker than she remembered but still warm. The capital agrees with you. Papa, why didn't you tell me you were sick sooner? Didn't want to worry you. You had enough to worry about, learning how to be a lady of the court and all that. He managed a small smile. Tell me about him, the king. Is he good to you? He is. Her voice caught. He's good to me. Good. Her father closed his eyes, looking peaceful in a way that frightened her more than any amount of pain would have. Then I don't have to worry anymore. He passed 3 days later, quietly, in his sleep, with Mira holding his hand the whole night through. She stayed in the village another week after that, helping settle his affairs, saying goodbye to neighbors who had known her since she was a child, walking the fences he had spent his whole life mending. The days in the village passed slowly, full of small tasks that somehow felt necessary, even though none of them could bring her father back. She sorted through his belongings, finding old letters from her mother tucked into a drawer he had never mentioned, tied together with string that had gone brittle with age. She found the tools he had used to fix the fences, worn smooth from years of handling, and could not bring herself to sell them, even though she had no use for them at the castle. In the end, she gave them to Corwin's family, who still lived 2 villages over, knowing her father would have liked the idea of his tools staying in hands that would use them well. The neighbors came by in a steady stream over those days, bringing food she barely touched and stories about her father she had never heard before, small kindnesses he had done for people over the years that he had never once mentioned to her. An old woman named Petra told her about the winter her roof had collapsed under heavy snow, and how Mira's father had shown up before dawn, 3 days running, to help rebuild it, refusing any payment beyond a warm meal. A younger man, barely older than Mira, told her that her father had quietly covered his family's debt to the miller 2 winters back, and made him promise never to mention it to anyone. He was a good man, Petra told her, holding both of Mira's hands in hers. Quiet, but good. The best kind, if you ask me. The kind who does right by people without needing anyone to see it. Mira carried those stories with her when she finally left the village, folded up alongside her grief like something small and precious she could keep close. She understood her father a little better now than she had before, understood the quiet weight he had carried all those years after her mother died, understood, too, why he had never fully explained the old debt that eventually brought her to the capital. He had spent his whole life doing quiet good for people who never knew to thank him properly, and in some strange way, sending his daughter into a king's household to settle an old family obligation had simply been one more quiet, necessary thing he did without complaint. When she finally rode back to the capital, she felt changed in a way she could not quite name. Older, maybe. Heavier, but not in a bad way. Like she had set down something she had been carrying and picked up something else in its place. Ronan was waiting at the gates when she arrived, though she had not sent word ahead about which day she would return. He must have had someone watching the road for days. He did not say anything when she dismounted. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her there, in front of the guards and the stable hands and anyone else who happened to be watching, and for once, Mira did not care who saw. "I'm sorry," he said quietly into her hair, "about your father. Thank you for the guards, for letting me go. I would have gone with you myself if I could have left the kingdom for that long." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "I missed you, more than I expected to, more than I think I'm supposed to admit." "You can admit it," she said. "I missed you too." Talia found her that same evening, unable to wait even one night before asking about every detail of the journey. She sat at the foot of Mira's bed, listening quietly for once, instead of filling the silence with her usual chatter, and when Mira finished talking about her father, Talia simply reached over and squeezed her hand. "He sounds like he was proud of you," Talia said. "Fathers like that don't come around often. You were lucky to have him, even if it wasn't for long enough. I keep thinking I should feel guilty for being happy here when he's gone. That's not how it works in my experience." Talia's voice carried more wisdom than her usual bright chatter let on. "My own mother passed when I was young. Took me years to understand that being happy afterward doesn't mean you loved them any less. It just means you kept living, the way they'd have wanted you to." Mira thought about that long after Talia left for the night, and found some comfort in it, even if the grief did not disappear entirely. It simply settled into something she could carry alongside everything else, rather than something that crushed her under its weight. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself back in the garden long after the castle had gone quiet. Sitting on the familiar stone bench under a sky full of stars she did not recognize the names of. She heard footsteps a while later and was not surprised to find Ronan approaching, a blanket over his shoulder that he wrapped around her without being asked. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Kept thinking about him, about all the things I never got to ask." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I don't even know how he and my mother met. I never asked. I always thought there would be time. Tell me about her, your mother, what you do remember." So she did, talking quietly into the dark for the better part of an hour. Memories she had not spoken aloud in years, spilling out easily in the safety of his listening silence. He did not try to fix her grief or rush her through it. He simply listened, the way he had learned to listen to guards and stable hands and anyone else the court usually overlooked, and by the time she finished, some of the weight in her chest had eased, just slightly, just enough. The weeks after her return passed differently than before. Something had settled between them, a certainty that had not been there previously, though neither of them rushed to put a name to it. They still walked the garden most mornings. They still sat together at meals, though the empty chairs around them had long since filled in with guests who no longer questioned Mira's place at the head table. Delphine's comments grew quieter, then stopped altogether, once it became clear that whatever Mira lacked in political knowledge, she made up for in the way the whole castle had softened around her. The guards greeted her by name now, with genuine warmth rather than polite formality. The kitchen staff saved her favorite bread rolls without being asked. Even Talia had stopped treating her like a curious puzzle and started treating her like a friend, which mattered more to Mira than any noble's approval ever could. It was Serena who finally brought up the subject nobody else dared to mention directly. "My son intends to ask you something soon," she told Mira one afternoon, the two of them walking together through the same gardens where everything had started. "I thought you should have some warning, so you're not caught entirely by surprise." Mira felt her heart skip. "Ask me what?" Serena raised an eyebrow, amused. "I think you already know, child. I'm simply telling you so you have time to prepare your answer, rather than standing there stunned when the moment comes." Mira did not sleep well that night, though not from worry. She lay awake turning the possibility over in her mind, examining it from every angle, and found that no matter how she looked at it, the answer she already knew she would give did not change. The question came a week later, not at some grand feast in front of the whole kingdom, but in the garden, in the quiet hour just after sunrise, on the same stone bench where they had first sat together as something more than strangers. Ronan did not make a long speech. He was never a man for long speeches. He simply took her hands in his, the way he had done that morning before she left to see her father, and looked at her with an expression that held no uncertainty in it at all. "I've known for a long time what I wanted to ask you," he said. "I just wanted to be sure you were ready to hear it, and that I wasn't asking for the wrong reasons. I'm not asking because a kingdom needs a queen, or because my mother thinks you'd be good for me, though she does, loudly and often. I'm asking because I cannot picture another morning in this garden without you, and I don't want to try." Mira felt tears gathering, though these were nothing like the tears she had cried before leaving to see her father. These felt lighter, warmer, full of something that did not need explaining. "Yes," she said, before he had even finished asking the actual question, and they both laughed, a little breathless, a little disbelieving that any of it had actually happened. He slipped a ring onto her finger that had belonged to his grandmother, simple and worn smooth with age rather than heavy with jewels, and told her he had chosen it specifically because it looked like something that had been loved rather than something meant only to impress. She thought it was the perfect choice, and told him so, and he looked so pleased with himself that she laughed again, right there on the bench, with the sun barely up and the whole garden still wet with morning dew. News of the engagement spread through the castle before breakfast was even finished being served, the way news always seemed to travel faster than anyone could track its source. Odessa cried into her apron when she heard, insisting it was only because the bread had burned and had nothing to do with sentiment, though nobody in the kitchen believed her for a second. Talia hugged Mira so hard she nearly knocked them both over, already talking through a dozen ideas for the wedding, before Mira had even had a chance to think about any of it herself. Corwin simply nodded at her the next time their paths crossed, the same quiet nod he always gave her, though something in his eyes suggested he was prouder than he let on. Even Serena, who rarely allowed herself any public display of emotion, held Mira's face in both hands when she heard the news, studying her for a long moment before pulling her into an embrace that lasted longer than either of them probably intended. "I chose well that night," Serena said quietly, only for Mira to hear. "I knew it then. I am glad to see I was right." The wedding took place in early autumn, in the same great hall where the feast had first brought them together, though the room looked different this time, filled with flowers instead of empty chairs, with laughter that felt warm instead of loud and hollow. The preparations in the weeks leading up to the ceremony kept the entire castle busy from dawn until well past dark. Talia oversaw the fitting of Mira's dress with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign, insisting on 3 separate rounds of adjustments before declaring herself satisfied. Odessa took over the kitchens completely, banning anyone she considered unnecessary from setting foot near her ovens, muttering about the importance of getting every dish exactly right for a day that would only happen once. Even Corwin found himself pulled into decorating the stables, since half the guests would be arriving on horseback, and Serena insisted every corner of the castle grounds look its best. Mira wore a simple dress, nothing like the elaborate gowns the noblewomen had expected her to choose, and when questioned about it by a particularly persistent tailor, she had simply said that she wanted to feel like herself on the most important day of her life, not like someone playing a part. The dress was pale blue, the color of the sky just before sunrise, with none of the heavy jewels or layered fabric the court favored. When she looked in the mirror on the morning of the wedding, she saw, for the first time in a long while, someone who looked entirely like herself, no longer trying to shrink into a smaller version to avoid attention. Serena stood near the front of the hall throughout the ceremony, her face unreadable in the way it usually was, though those who knew her well noticed the way her eyes stayed a little too bright the whole time, and the way she dabbed at them once, quickly, with the edge of her sleeve, before anyone could comment on it. When the moment came for her to speak the traditional blessing over the couple, her voice did not waver once, though everyone in the hall could tell exactly how much effort that steadiness cost her. Delphine attended too, seated toward the back, and though her smile did not quite reach her eyes, she approached Mira afterward with what seemed like genuine, if reluctant, respect. "I underestimated you," she admitted. "I don't often admit that. Consider it a rare gift." "I'll take it," Mira said, smiling. At the feast that followed, the tables were arranged differently than before. There were no empty chairs left at the ends, no isolated seats marking off invisible boundaries. Mira sat beside Ronan at the head of the table, exactly where she belonged, and this time, nobody in the entire hall looked twice at the arrangement, because it no longer seemed strange at all. It seemed, to everyone watching, like the most natural thing in the world. The music that night carried on well past midnight, and at some point during the celebration, Ronan pulled Mira away from the crowd toward the same open space in front of the stage where they had danced badly together during the Harvest Festival. This time the musician playing was skilled, the melody slow and easy, and they danced properly, no longer stumbling over their own feet, though Mira suspected she would treasure the memory of their clumsy festival dance every bit as much as this one. "My father would have liked you," Ronan said quietly, his forehead resting against hers as they moved slowly to the music. "He had a good sense for people. He would have seen exactly what my mother saw that first night. I wish I could have met him. He's here, in a way, in this hall, in this whole night." Ronan pulled back just enough to look at her properly. "I think he'd say I finally did something right." Serena raised her cup once more that night, the same gesture she had made all those months ago, toward her son and the girl who had once sat alone and unnoticed, and was now anything but. This time the whole hall raised their cups back, and the sound that followed was not the low, uncertain silence of that first night, but something loud and warm and full, the sound of an entire kingdom finally understanding what their king and his mother had seen from the very beginning. Outside the castle walls, the border pack that Mira had once called home received word of the wedding within days, carried by a messenger who rode hard and fast to bring the news before rumor could distort it. The old debt, whatever it had truly meant all those years, was quietly considered settled, though not in the way anyone had originally imagined. Nobody in Mira's home village ever fully understood the strange path that had led their neighbor's daughter to a crown, but they told the story anyway, at gatherings and firesides for years afterward, of the girl who sat alone at a feast until a queen decided that alone was not where she belonged. Petra, the old woman from the village, told the story every winter to whichever children would sit still long enough to listen, always ending it the same way. "Kindness finds its way back around," she would say. "Remember that, whatever else you forget." And in the castle gardens, the early morning walks continued, season after season, long after the wedding, long after the crowds and celebrations had faded into memory. Two people, still finding quiet comfort in the same stone bench, still choosing each other in small, unremarkable moments that nobody else ever needed to see, because those moments had never been for anyone else's benefit in the first place. They had only ever been for the two of them.